One of the most puzzling episodes in the history of medical science in South Australia occurred in the winter of 1936. Two men died, and although the cause of death was determined, why it happened has never been discovered. British Science was an oil tanker, one of many in the British Tanker Company fleet, owned by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, transporting oil around the world. The tanker anchored in Port Adelaide in July. On board were two seamen, cabin mates, a 43-year-old Irishman from County Wexford, named William Hayes, and a Liverpudlian, aged 20, named Bernard Anderson, who had joined the crew in April 1935 and was studying for his officer's certificate. While the ship was discharging petroleum products at Birkenhead, on the evening of the 23rd of July, Anderson went ashore with two crewmates, boatswain Robert Brown and a sailor named Edward Brown, at about 6 p.m. The three men went to the Birkenhead Hotel and had a drink before going on to the pictures in Port Adelaide. Anderson purchased some caramel lollies, which he shared with his companions. They finished their evening at a pie shop in Port Adelaide, where Anderson and one of the men both had a pie and a cup of coffee. The other sailor had a pie and a glass of milk. Hayes was not with the group, and none of the sailors questioned saw him in the pie shop that evening. Hayes had gone ashore, but not for long. He bought some newspapers and was back on the ship by 8 p.m. He ate a meat sandwich and had a cup of tea in company with two other sailors. Anderson arrived back shortly after midnight. After Anderson returned to the ship, he started to feel ill at about 4 o'clock in the morning, as he told Robert Brown, who saw Anderson at about 8 a.m. ill in a bathroom. Anderson reported that he had not eaten anything since returning to the ship. At 8:55 a.m., Hayes was lying in his bunk and looked normal, but complained that he was experiencing stomach cramps. A doctor came on board and examined both men, quizzing them on what they had eaten. Anderson said the pie and coffee was the only meal that he had partaken, while Hayes had had a bottle of beer and 2 apples. The doctor diagnosed a mild food poisoning. At 5:30 p.m., the British Science left port on its journey to Balikpapan in Borneo. At 8 p.m. that night, Anderson's skin colour had become noticeably darker, taking on a bronze complexion. By the next morning, both men had severe stomach cramps. The chief steward, Robert Gibson, took their temperatures and both were found to be normal, but their eyes were becoming bloodshot. Captain Large made the decision to return to Outer Harbour at 9 a.m. the next morning, and the ship turned around and retraced the 180 miles it had come. Captain Large, who by that time had 24 years' experience working on oil tankers, had never heard of a similar event occurring. He said there had been no outbreaks of illness and no complaints of fumes in the weeks prior to July 23rd. The ship arrived at Semaphore about 2 a.m. Sunday morning, 26th of July. Here Doctors Porter, Hone, Ponsford and Moore boarded the vessel and checked the men. Dr. Porter remained with them as the ship continued on down the Lefevre Peninsula to Outer Harbour. On Sunday night, with their conditions worsening, by now Hayes too had the same peculiar brown hue to his skin, both men were transferred to hospital in Adelaide. At 6:30 a.m. Monday morning, Bernard Anderson died. Hayes was described as more strongly built than Anderson, which may explain how he was able to endure longer. Doctors had determined that the men were both suffering from hemolysis, the breakdown of the red blood corpuscles, which were starving their bodies of oxygen. The hemoglobin released by the destruction of the blood cells was the cause of the darkening of their skin colour. Transfusions of blood were arranged to enable the tainted blood to be drawn off. Hayes began to rally as he received oxygen and fresh blood. In all, Hayes received about 7 pints of blood from volunteers during his hospitalisation. Red blood cells normally endure for about 90 to 120 days in circulation, with about 1% of them breaking down each day. The spleen removes the old cells, while a balance in numbers is maintained by new cells being created in the blood marrow. While doctors and nurses fought to save Hayes, the cause of the affliction was sought. Nobody else on board ship was ill, and the two men had gone ashore separately. Other than sharing the same cabin, they rarely associated together. Therefore, suspicion focused on the cabin. 4 detectives questioned the crew, but found no reason to suspect that there was any bad feeling among the men. There was no hint of anybody intentionally harming either man, nor any suggestion of self-harm. The air in the fuel tank, which was situated below the cabin, was tested, which showed it to be fresh, with only a minimal hydrocarbon vapour present. The cabin was fumigated, and Edward Brown and another sailor, Charles Pullen, had already moved into the vacated room by the 29th of July. The cabin was considered the best available in the forecastle, due to it having a large ventilator and that it only accommodated 2 men, unlike other cabins which held 3 or 4. The medicine given to the men on board the ship was analysed, along with a sample of the ship's fuel, but nothing unusual was found. The ship was checked for leaking fumes, but again that did nothing to explain the men's state. Robert Brown stated at the inquest that he had been on board the British Science for 3 years, and there had not been any trouble with fumes. Anderson was buried in Cheltenham Cemetery, resting place of many sailors from around the world, on Tuesday afternoon, 28th of July. 16 officers and crew from the ship attended the funeral. All week Hayes remained in a severe condition. His organs had been affected by the lack of oxygen, but the medical staff were still hopeful that they could recover their functions. At 1:30 p.m. Sunday afternoon, 2nd of August, Hayes succumbed to kidney failure, brought on by the hemolysis. Hayes was laid to rest beside Anderson on the 4th of August. Today their grave is unmarked, although the location is known, close to the fence by Port Road. There were 5 possible causes of hemolysis considered by the doctors. Snakebite was possible, but unlikely, and nobody reported seeing any reptile on board. Being winter in Adelaide, it was even less likely. Malaria and blackwater fever can cause a delayed onset of hemolytic anemia, but the chances of both men having contracted malaria and then falling victim to a rare complication at the same time were so astronomical as to be impossible. Stibine, or antimony trihydrite, is a toxic gas. It has been used as a fumigant in the past, but rarely, and has a smell like rotten eggs. Had the gas been present, others would have noticed it. Lead poisoning was a possible cause. The men had been painting prior to falling ill, and paints in the 1930s contained lead. But how could they have absorbed enough of it to kill them? And again, at the same time. Surely other seamen had been engaged in painting also. With those possibilities excluded, arseniuretted hydrogen, or arsine, remains as the one possible culprit. In the opinion of bacteriologist Dr. Bassett, the 2 men had inhaled this gas sometime between midnight and 2:30 a.m. on July 24th. In small quantities it is odorless, and in lethal amounts has a garlic-like smell, which could easily be accepted as a cooking odour. Arsine is a heavy gas and settles in lower areas. It is created when arsenic is exposed to an acid. Dr. Bassett said that arsine poisoning had killed 11 people on board the Dutch ship Vaterland in 1905 en route to New York, and that minor poisonings had occurred from vapours released by batteries in submarines. Could this have occurred accidentally on the tanker? The acting director of the Department of Chemistry at the University of Adelaide, Charles Chapman, had made a careful examination for traces of arsenic, but none was found, and nobody else even fell mildly ill. Arsine was considered a possible chemical weapon in the build-up to World War II, although was ultimately never used in battle. Could some military intelligence agents have been experimenting on live subjects? questions with no answers. The cause of these mysterious deaths has been forever lost on the deep tide that ebbs into the dark corners of history.